Well, good morning once again. Well, here we are during the days of unleavened bread. This festival is moving past very rapidly. The days of unleavened bread are in many ways a festival that celebrates freedom and liberty. You know, down through time, there has been a resonance to the sound of liberty among human beings. People have been rallied to the cause over and over again in the name of freedom, in the name of liberty. Over 200 years ago, I guess this summer it'll be 223 years ago, a group of men gathered in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and signed a document that is one of the most famous documents in modern history. It is the Declaration of Independence. And they signed that document, and at the conclusion of that document, they pledge their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. That's the way it was phrased. Their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor to the carrying out of this cause, the launching of a new government, a new nation that was based on the premise of liberty and freedom. And this was expressed in the document. Now, a few years later, in fact, just a matter of about 13 years later, there was another revolution that was launched. This was in 1789 in France. And that particular revolution had as its slogan, liberty, brotherhood, and equality. That was the idea that was promulgated, yet within just a matter of time, the French Revolution had turned into the reign of terror. And many of those who had launched the revolution and had been quick to do all of these things in the name of liberty, in the name of brotherhood, in the name of equality, that was their rallying cry. And many of them wound up actually devoured by the revolution they had launched, themselves losing their heads to the guillotine. Throughout the 19th and the 20th centuries, particularly in the 20th century, over and over and over again, how many dictators, how many despots, how many individuals have risen to power on some sort of coup, some sort of revolution, with promises of liberty, promises of liberation. You look all over the world, and you've got the such and such liberation army. They're going to provide liberty. Well, there are dictatorships throughout Africa, throughout Asia. There have been in Latin America. There are in areas of Europe that have all risen to power, not with the promise that we're going to grind you into the ground, but with the promise that we will give you liberty. We will give you freedom over and over and over again. Promises of liberty, promises of freedom. And that appeals to human beings. Many of us remember very vividly back in the fall of 1989 when communist governments in Eastern Europe began to topple like dominoes. I remember watching on television people pouring through the Brandenburg Gate there at the Berlin Wall, separating East and West Berlin, as it was at that time. People pouring through, dancing in the shadow of the wall. Dancing in the shadows of the wall. Celebrating. There was a euphoria in the air. These people thought, now we've got freedom. For decades, the menace of the Soviet Union, they had clamped the boot on Eastern Europe in the aftermath of World War II, and the Red Army threatened any potential uprising, anybody who, whether it was Hungary, whether it was Czechoslovakia, wherever it was, there was a threat of armed force to move in and to put a clamp on anything that would overthrow the status quo. Then in a matter of weeks, the whole system collapsed. And people celebrated there's going to be peace. The Cold War is over. Peace. You remember seeing the scenes on television when the red flag, the hammer and sickle, was lowered from atop the Kremlin? A sight that most of us who remember the 50s and the 60s and the Cold War and the communist menace and all of the things that were, the fallout shelters and all of the things that characterized the 50s and 60s in this country. A sight that was hard to imagine that we would have ever seen. Not a shot fired. Amazing things. People celebrated liberty, freedom. And yet, as we survey the situation in Eastern Europe right now, we find that these circumstances haven't brought liberty, haven't brought freedom. Oh, there have been some things that have been better, but in other cases, other individuals have come to power, and as we understand from Bible prophecy, many of those who are seeking liberty and freedom are going to find that something is going to come to power in their nations that will provide the very opposite of liberty and freedom. Now, that's not unique to them, because over and over, it's like a cruel hoax has been perpetrated on people all over the world. That desire, that craving, that yearning for liberty, for freedom. And yet over and over again, it has been a matter of an old system coming back to power, maybe with a different face, maybe with a different name, but the results were the same over and over again. You see, as we go through the story, Peter talks about something similar in a spiritual vein. In 2 Peter chapter 2, Peter gives a warning beginning in verse 1. There were false prophets among the people, there shall be false teachers among you. So Peter, writing at the end of his life, addressing the New Testament church as it was in the late 60s A.D., said there is a pattern that has been established. You can look back at the Old Testament Scriptures and you can see over and over again how individuals came along. False individuals, false prophets. And he said, that pattern is going to continue. So Peter warned the people of what they could expect. Then he talked about God's judgment. Verse 4, God spared not the angels that sinned. Verse 5, God spared not the old world, but saved Noah. Verse 6, God turned the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah into ashes and delivered Lot. The point is, in verse 9, the Lord knows how to deliver the godly out of temptations, out of trials and tests and tribulations, and to reserve the unjust unto the day of judgment to be punished. The point is, Peter said, as he told the people, you see all this stuff going on, it's been in the past, it'll be in the future. But he said, don't ever forget this, God knows who's who and what's what. God has dealt over and over and over again the angels that sinned, the pre-flood world, Sodom and Gomorrah. The point is, God knows how to deliver the godly, and He knows how to reserve the unjust to the time of judgment. Peter went on addressing this and talking about various individuals and the tactics that they used. And notice what he says in verse 18. When they speak great swelling words of vanity, they allure through the lust of the flesh, through much wantonness, those that were clean escaped from them who live in error. Now, who are the ones that are clean escaped from those that live in error? The world lies in error. The world lies under the rule of the wicked one. The whole world lies in darkness, spiritually. Those who are clean escaped from those that live in error are those that have been converted. Those that have responded to God's call. So here we find those who are allured, who are enticed, who are attracted. Those who had clean escaped, who had made the escape good. There are those, I knew a man in Houston in the church who as a teenager had crossed the no man's land between East and West Germany. He was born in what was, I guess, at that time, Nazi-occupied Poland, or right around the time his birth was around the time that Hitler's Hitler's troops came in and occupied Poland. And in the aftermath of the war, he was in East Germany, and as a teenager, managed to be the only one of his family who actually successfully escaped. Now, there are many individuals who have risked their lives. We're familiar with the Cuban boat people who, over and over again, the thousands and thousands that have tried to flee Castro's Cuba and come to the United States, others from other areas. People who have gone through tremendous risk and difficulty and hardship to get away, pursuing liberty. Now, what Peter describes here is the spiritual equivalent. Those who have clean escaped from them that live in error, now being enticed and drawn back into the very thing that they had escaped. Now, these individuals who do the enticing and attracting, what do they promise? Verse 19, while they promise them liberty. While they promise them liberty, they themselves are the servants of corruption, for of whom a man is overcome, of the same is he brought into bondage. If after they have escaped the pollutions of the world through the knowledge of the Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, they're again entangled therein and overcome, conquered by that, the latter end is worse with them than the beginning. Now the point is, here are individuals who are enticed, who are allured, who are promised liberty. Any of you who've ever done any fishing know that when you fish, depending on what you're fishing for, what kind of fish you're fishing for, you vary the bait. Because the fish doesn't go for the hook. He goes for the bait. It's just when he swallows the bait, he gets the hook along with it. Now, he wasn't expecting the hook. He wasn't out looking for a hook. He was looking for something that enticed him. Fishermen have a tackle box, and in that tackle box they have many lures. Depending on what they're fishing for and the circumstances, they use different lures. Now, Satan is a pretty good fisherman. And he's got a tackle box full of lures. Now, the lure that he may use for you, and the lure he may use for me, and the lure he may use for someone else may be different lures depending on what he's fishing for. But he's got a tackle box full of lures. And you see, we don't go for the hook. We're enticed, we're attracted by the lure. Here it says, while they promise them liberty, they don't promise slavery. They don't promise oppression. They don't promise destruction. They promise them liberty. But the devil does not believe in truth in packaging. He's not a believer in truth in advertising. You've all seen the big billboards up. Marlboro Country. Boy, you see this big rugged guy. He's up there on the horse, and he's, you got the sweep of the plains out behind him. That looks exciting. That looks, tough and masculine, all these things. Marlboro Country. Now, if they really wanted to show Marlboro Country, why don't they put a billboard up and the picture, instead of this, vibrant cowboy out on a horse, maybe they could show some poor old fella in the VA hospital laying up there with a trach coming out of his throat. And put the sign up there that says Marlboro Country. Because that would be a far more accurate presentation. Marlboro Country. Oh, they sell sophistication, they sell excitement, they sell all of the various things. It doesn't matter, you see, because what they're selling, because the three common things that are appealed to are the lust of the eyes, the lust of the flesh, and the pride of life. That's what's out there. John says in 1 John 2, all that is in the world. The lust of the eyes, the lust of the flesh, the pride of life. That summarizes what's out there. What's there to entice, to appeal, to allure. So they promise them liberty, but they themselves are the servants of corruption. For of whom a man is overcome, of the same is he brought into bondage. Something that overcomes. Let's go back to 2 Timothy. In 2 Timothy chapter 2, let's notice verse 24. The servant of the Lord must not strive, but be gentle unto all men, apt to teach, patient, in meekness instructing those that oppose themselves. If God, peradventure, will give them repentance to the acknowledging of the truth. That's what real repentance is. It involves an acknowledging of the truth, not just with our mouth, but with our heart. Acknowledging the truth, and therefore turning around and going the other way. That they may recover themselves out of the snare of the devil, who are taken captive by him at his will. The snare of the devil. Maybe some of you have done a little trapping in times past. Maybe set a snare for a bird or an animal. And again, the snare is baited. There's something there to attract. And we find a description of the world taken captive by the devil at his will. Mr. Armstrong wrote a booklet a number of years ago entitled A World Held Captive. And we live in a world held captive. Going all the way back to the book of Genesis, when you read the story of Adam and Eve in the garden, and how Satan was more subtle. The serpent was more subtle than any beast of the field, and how he enticed the woman. We're told that, he asked her, as God said, you can't eat any of the fruit of the trees here? Nice place you live, and can you eat anything here? Well, she said, we can have the fruit of the trees of the garden, any of the fruit of the trees in the garden, except for the tree in the midst of the garden, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. God has said, don't touch it, don't eat of it, lest you die. And Satan said, you shall not surely die. Oh, no, you're not going to die. Oh, you thought you would die? Oh, no. If you eat of this, you'll be like God. You can't die. Why, you're an immortal soul. Didn't God tell you that? Eve began to look. And we're told, the tree looked good. It was good to the eyes. It was a tree to be desired to make one wise. It looked pretty. It undoubtedly smelled nice. I'm sure it tasted good. But God said, don't eat of it. You see, an enticement, an allure that is there. Now, God gives us choices because in the process of freeing us from the captivity, and we're going to examine that a little more closely, God sets choices before us, but God makes plain what those choices are and where they lead. He told ancient Israel after he had brought them out of Egypt, he said, I set before you a choice. I set before you life and death, good and evil. Choose life that you and your seed may live. You see, God makes plain where choices lead. God doesn't do things the way the devil does. The devil tries to allure and entice us into making choices that will lead to our destruction. But he never advertises them for what they truly are and what the ultimate consequences are. And so people are attracted to the bait. The lure is colorful. It is attractive. It looks good to the eyes. It appeals. But you see, there is a deadly hook that is attached, and that we must never lose sight of. In the book of Romans, the Apostle Paul addresses the subject. Romans chapter 5, or chapter 6 rather, coming on down, Paul talks about in verse 12, let not sin therefore reign in your mortal body, that you should obey it in the lust thereof. Let not sin be the ruling, dominating, controlling force of your life. Neither yield you your members as instruments of unrighteousness unto sin, but yield yourselves unto God. Verse 14, sin shall not have dominion, lordship, rulership over you, for you're not under the law, but under grace. Now what does that mean? Verse 15, Paul addresses the question, what then? Shall we sin because we're not under the law, but under grace? God forbid. Know you not that to whom you yield yourselves servants to obey, his servants you are to whom you obey, whether of sin unto death or of obedience unto righteousness. Verse 18, being then made free from sin, you became the servants of righteousness. You see, the enticement that we saw earlier that Peter talked about, individuals promising liberty, but in reality providing enslavement. Because ultimately, sin is an enslaving master. And there is a consequence to sin. The consequences, the results, the wages of sin is death. And death is the ultimate captivity. A lot of you undoubtedly have read about Houdini, the most famous magician and escape artist of the 20th century. A remarkable man in terms of what he was able to do, and he attracted quite a bit of notoriety in his day. He would come into an area he claimed to be able to escape from anything. And he would have himself locked in a jail cell. They could chain him up, lock him in a jail cell, put his clothes in another room. So that, guaranteed he had nothing hidden on him, as far as they could tell. And, in a short matter of time, here he was outside and had his clothes on, the jail was open, and there he was. He did remarkable things. He, on several occasions, had himself chained, hands and feet chained, locked up and put underwater. And underwater, he managed to, in the short amount of time that he had, to get free of the chains. And here he was, popping up above the water. He was able to escape. He was an escape artist, could escape, prided himself on being able to escape from anything, anywhere, anytime. Houdini also, spiritualism was a big thing back in the 1920s, seances and all this sort of thing. And Houdini, being a master of tricks, considered himself a debunker of these spiritualists and many of the frauds that were perpetrated, and he would expose how they were pulling some of these tricks and many of these things, and attracted attention for that. On his deathbed, he talked to his wife and he told her that he didn't know what lay beyond the grave, and he didn't know, whether it was possible to escape, but if it was, he would. And he knew that, fortune tellers and various ones in these seances would claim that they'd contacted him, and he gave his wife a code. And he said, unless they have this code, you'll know it's not me. But if it's possible to escape, I'll escape. Well, Houdini never escaped. The great escape artist wasn't able to escape the grave. He's held in the grave. The only one who has escaped the grave. Lazarus came back out of the grave. Jesus called him out of the grave. Lazarus came back out of the grave for a matter of a few years. But the time came when the grave swallowed Lazarus back up, and he is dead. There were those that, Christ healed or that others healed, some who were even raised from the dead. But it was a temporary physical healing. And they continued on in their life. Jairus' daughter, various ones that are mentioned in the Scriptures. The little child of the woman there that Elisha raised up, mentioned back in Kings, various ones that are mentioned. And what you find, of course, is it was a temporary physical healing. Ultimately, the grave has swallowed up all and has held them and holds them. With one exception. With one exception. Captivity. Sin holds people captive, and the ultimate sting of sin is death. Paul talks about in Romans 6:18 being made free from sin. He talks about on further in Romans chapter 7 and verse 12 that the law is holy and the commandment is holy and just and good. Then he says in verse 14, the law is spiritual, but I'm carnal. You know, that's such a plain, simple concept. You wonder how it is that people get confused. Now, the law is spiritual and I'm carnal. Which one do you think God wants to keep and which one do you think He wants to change? Does He want to change the spiritual law to be like carnal me and carnal you? Or does He want to change carnal us to be like the spiritual law? Why would God change the spiritual to be like the carnal? No, the law is spiritual and we're carnal. And ultimately what God is in the process of doing is what? Through the new covenant, writing His law, His spiritual law, the commandments that are holy and just and good, writing that which is spiritual, holy, just, and good in our hearts and our minds, transforming and changing us to reflect the nature of God. Having the divine nature. Paul went on in Romans chapter 7 down in verse 22. He said, I delight in the law of God after the inward man. That's really what I want, what I desire. But he said, there's like a war going on in my body, in my mind. I see another law in my members warring against the law of my mind, bringing me into captivity to the law of sin which is in my members. O wretched man that I am, who shall deliver me from the body of death? Paul recognized that he was captive and could not deliver himself. He talked about, he says, it's like a war going on. My body pulls me one way, and yet I have chosen another way. How will I be delivered? Well, we're told here, continuing on in chapter 8, there is therefore now no condemnation to them which are in Jesus Christ, who walk not after the flesh, but after the Spirit. Which direction are we headed? The way we walk. Are we walking and pursuing the way that the flesh leads us, or are we walking and pursuing the way that the Spirit leads us? The law of the Spirit of life in Christ Jesus has made me free from the law of sin and death. The righteousness of the law, verse 4, might be fulfilled in us who walk not after the flesh, but after the Spirit. It talks about the creation itself, verse 21, ultimately being delivered from the bondage of corruption into the glorious liberty of the children of God. A deliverance from bondage to liberty. The liberty that Christ promises is real liberty, not the false liberty, the substitute, not promising them liberty and making slaves. When you go back to the story of the Exodus, we're not reading of the story of a people who won freedom for themselves. The story recorded in the book of Exodus is not the story of a group of people who rose up and overthrew Pharaoh by feat of arms. It's not the story of people who liberated themselves, who launched a revolution, who won freedom for themselves. It is the story of a people who were enslaved and who had been deprived even of hope of deliverance. God took the initiative in dealing with Moses. Moses was shepherding his father-in-law's sheep, as he had been doing for about 40 years. And you read the story in Exodus 3. He was on the backside of the desert, the mountain near Mount Horeb, better known as Mount Sinai to us. And he looked and he saw a bush that was burning with fire. And it burned and it burned and it burned, but it wasn't spreading and it wasn't burning up. Now, that was a remarkable sight, and Moses went up there to see what was going on. And when he got close, he heard a voice that boomed out and said, "Moses, take your shoes off. The ground you're standing on is holy ground." And God began to deal with Moses. And to say, "I've got a job for you. I want you to go back to Egypt and you tell Pharaoh, 'Let my people go.'" Now Moses had excuses. Egypt was not really where Moses had in mind to go. He'd been out of there 40 years. He left with a price on his head. He didn't want to go back. Have you ever noticed that when you don't want to do something, you can come up with all these good reasons as to why that won't work and why you can't? And when you really want to do something, oh, well, hey, that's no problem. We can figure out a way. We can somehow maneuver around. We're all that way. When we really want to do something, we find ways to do it. When we don't want to do something, we can come up with reasons, and they sound pretty plausible. Sometimes we can convince others, it's just, it's too far, it's too hard, whatever it is. Moses had all these reasons. Now, he ran into a problem because, you see, you can't convince God. And Moses had reasons as to why he shouldn't be the one. He said, "Well, look, I'm going to go back, and I'm going to say to God, God said, I'm going to deliver you from Egypt. And I'm going to tell the Israelites that God sent me, and they're going to say, 'What's his name?' And I'm going to say, 'I don't know.' I can't go do that." And God said, "I'll tell you, I am that I am. I'll tell you my name." Moses said, "Yeah, but I'm going to go to Pharaoh and say, 'Let my people go.' And Pharaoh's going to say, 'No.' Then what am I going to do? He won't believe me." And God began to demonstrate certain miracles, and he said, "I will back you up." And Moses said, "Yeah, but I really don't talk very well. I just have a problem with words." And God said, "Who made the mouth? Who made the tongue?" But I tell you what, I know your brother talks well, and so we'll use him to do the talking. God had an answer for every excuse. Moses had excuses because Moses really didn't want to do what God had called him to do. God sent him back and he told Pharaoh, "Let my people go." The God of Israel says, "Let my people go." And Pharaoh said, "Who is the God of Israel that I should obey him?" Now that was a question, and the question deserves an answer. And Pharaoh got one. God demonstrated who he was to Pharaoh. He was the great God, the creator God, the one that had made the heavens and the earth. He was the true God. And all that Pharaoh worshipped were false gods, were empty, futile gods. Pharaoh in Egypt worshipped the sun god. Pharaoh claimed to be a descendant of the sun god. And so the God of heaven, through Moses, sent along a plague that brought black darkness on the land, blotted out the sun for 3 days. Couldn't see your hand in front of your face. The great God who had sent Moses was far more powerful than what Pharaoh worshipped. The Egyptians worshipped the Nile River, and the Nile was the giver of life. Egypt was called the gift of the Nile. Egypt found out that the Nile was not really the life giver. The God of heaven was the life giver, because the God of heaven, through Moses, turned the Nile River into blood, and all the fish died. And what they considered the source of life became evidence of death. You see, life comes from God, the Creator. Over and over again, God dealt with Pharaoh and the Egyptians through Moses. Now we're told, as the matter proceeded on, in Exodus chapter 8, after the plague of swarms, in verse 25, Pharaoh called for Moses and Aaron, and he said, "I'll tell you what, go and sacrifice in the land." You see, Moses had said, we need to leave Egypt and go into the wilderness to sacrifice to God. Pharaoh offered a deal. If you're bound and determined to serve God, the devil offers some compromises. See, the first thing is don't go at all. I'm not going to let you go. If you're determined to go, serve God. then the devil offers compromises. And here's the first compromise. Don't leave Egypt. Serve God here in Egypt. You can't serve God on the devil's terms. You can't remain in Egypt and serve God. God had called His people to leave Egypt. The way of life that God called them to was totally different. You can't sort of fit it all together. You can't hold on to one and the other. To serve God, we've got to forsake Egypt, to forsake Egypt in our hearts, to forsake spiritual Egypt. You can't serve God on the devil's terms. So the first attempt at compromise was, if you're determined to do it, well, just do it here. But you see, you can't do it here the way God said do it. A little later on in Exodus chapter 10, we read of a second compromise that Pharaoh offered. Plagues kept coming. In verse 8, Moses and Aaron were brought again unto Pharaoh, and he says, now, all right, I'll let you leave. I'll let you go and serve God, but who is it that's going to go? Who you have in mind? And Moses said, well, all of us. Our young, our old, our sons, our daughters, everything. And Pharaoh said, oh no, not the little ones. There's evil before you. Verse 10, I'm worried about the kids, Pharaoh said. I'll tell you what. You that are men and women, you go and serve God and let me babysit the kids. I'll watch after them. See, the devil's first attempt is he says, all right, if you're determined to serve God, then stay here and serve God on my terms. Just keep doing the same old stuff and we'll call it by a different name. Stay in Egypt. With all of its paganism. And we'll just call it by God's name. If you're not going to do that, then okay, you adults go ahead. But the devil volunteers to babysit the kids. Leave them behind. I'll take care of them, he says. People sometimes say, well, God gives us a choice. I give my kids a choice. That's right. God gives us a choice, but number one, He offered the choice to adults. Number two, He presented it in very clear terms. He didn't say, now would you rather, go to the ball game or stay home and watch TV, or would you rather, go with me and sit still for 2 hours? Well, then you present that choice to a young child and say, would you like to stay here and watch the cartoons, or you want to go with me and have to sit still for 2 hours? Oh, well, I guess maybe I'll stay and watch the cartoons. That's not the way God presented the choice to ancient Israel. He said, I set before you good and evil, life and death. Choose life. Well, the second compromise that Pharaoh offered was, if you're bound and determined to go, let the adults go, but I'll take care of the kids. Moses said no. Not so. Well, we come on down and a few more plagues, and finally Pharaoh called him back, verse 24, and he said, all right, I'll let all of you go to serve the Lord. Verse 24, but let your flocks and your herds stay here. You can even take the kids. If you're going to commit yourselves, at least don't commit your resources. Let those stay behind. I like Moses' answer in verse 26. He said, there shall not be one hoof left behind. How's that for not compromising? How's that for not compromising? Moses says, not one hoof is going to stay in Egypt. Everything comes. We're making a commitment to our God wholeheartedly, totally, completely. Everything that we are able to do with our whole hearts, we're going to serve God. We're going to go all the way out of Egypt, and everything that we have under our control is going to go with us. We're not leaving one hoof here in Egypt. We're not compromising. Because, you see, compromise tends to draw us back. It becomes a connection. If the devil somehow has a connection to sort of reel us back in. Again, back to the fisherman. He may let the fish play the line way on out. But as long as he's got it connected, then he has a means of gradually reeling them back in. Moses, the story of the Exodus is the story of a people delivered by God. It took miraculous, divine deliverance. The people were unable to deliver themselves. God did it. And He delivered them from Egypt that they might have liberty, true liberty. We saw earlier about how the devil takes the world captive at his will. If we go back to the book of Ephesians, chapter 4, notice what the Apostle Paul writes in Ephesians 4, verse 7. Unto every one of us is given grace, according to the measure of the gift of Christ. Grace means what is freely given and bestowed. We are given grace. We are given something freely offered, freely given, freely bestowed, according to the measure of the gift of Christ. Wherefore, he says, when He ascended up on high, He led captivity captive and gave gifts unto men. We're told that Satan holds the world captive, whom he takes captive at his will. Here we read of Jesus Christ, who ascended on high and led captivity captive. The ultimate captivity. Satan captures and ensnares through sin. And the ultimate captivity from which there has never been any human escape is the captivity of the grave. Jesus Christ came out of the grave 3 days and 3 nights after He went in. And when He ascended on high, He led captivity captive. He conquered and captured, triumphed over what has captured all humanity. And the result is, of course, He gave gifts unto men. You remember the night of the Passover when Jesus told the disciples, He said, it is expedient for you that I should go away. Because if I go away, I will send the Comforter. I will send you a gift. I will give you something. I will send the Spirit of truth. It will lead you into all the truth. I will come and dwell in you through the indwelling of the Holy Spirit of God. He ascended on high. He led captivity captive. He gave gifts unto men. Now He that ascended, what is He but that He also descended first into the lower parts of the earth? First, Jesus descended. He was buried. The same one that was buried is the same one that went up on high. He that ascended, verse 10, is the same also that, He that descended is the same also that ascended up far above all heavens, that He might fill all things. Jesus Christ died, gave Himself, was put into that grave, but has come back out. You know, Jesus told the disciples, recorded in Matthew chapter 12 and verse 40 as well as other places, but He told the disciples and the others that were around, because the Pharisees had come challenging Him, wanting a sign. And He told them in Matthew 12:39, no sign will be given but the sign of the prophet Jonah. Verse 40, for as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the whale's belly, so shall the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. Now, in a very unique way, this was a sign to the religious leaders. Well, let me show you that. First, let's pick up the account in Luke 23. Luke 23, we'll pick it up. It was about the 6th hour, verse 44. That's about 12 noon. This is the way the Romans counted time, beginning from 12 hours of the night and 12 hours of the day, and from sunup. So this was approximately 12 noon. You know the story. We went back through it on the evening of the Passover, how Jesus and His disciples came together and they observed the Passover, and then after the Passover concluded and the hymn was sung, they went out And they walked there to the Mount of Olives and to a garden there on the mount. And Jesus spent time in very intense prayer. And later on, after midnight in the early wee morning hours, Judas and a contingent of soldiers showed up. Jesus was arrested and was hauled off to the palace of the high priest. After a hearing, and a mockery of a hearing it was, he was finally hauled off to Pilate's palace, with the Jewish religious leadership demanding that Pilate should order his execution. Pilate talked to them, he talked to him, it went back and forth. Pilate was a politician. He wanted, in his mind, he wanted to turn him loose. He could see that it was because of envy that they wanted him crucified. But they began to make threats that they were going to make trouble. They were going to send a report to Caesar that Pilate was no friend of Caesar's. And Pilate began to get nervous. He didn't want trouble. He was a politician of the sort that we have seen so many in our time. He was sort of an opinion poll politician. He wanted to, see which way the wind was blowing. And so finally he decided, well, that was what was going to fit in, what was going to be popular, was crucified that morning, probably about 9 o'clock. And about 3 hours after he had been hanging there, the sky began to get dark. We looked out a little earlier, and it was like we were having a night service. The clouds moved in. Well, that day, about noon, the sun was at its brightest. Clouds began to very quickly move in. And it got darker and darker and darker. And finally, it was black dark. It was just like night. Didn't rain, but the clouds were there. The sun was blocked out, and there was darkness over all the land. And it hung on for 3 hours. Now, that's sort of a disquieting thing, when the weather looks stormy and things are going on. It makes people a little nervous. About 3 o'clock in the afternoon, as you put the accounts together in Matthew and in John, a soldier came by and thrust a spear into the side of Jesus Christ, and when he did, blood and water poured out. Jesus cried out with a loud voice, "It is finished," and he died. At the time that happened, this intense darkness all over everything, the ground began to shake and tremble. Now, being in the dark is disquieting and discomforting enough. But if while you're in the dark, the ground begins to shake, that becomes a little more serious. And the ground began to shake and quake. If you've ever been in an earthquake, it's like, it's sort of like thunder coming up from the ground, from deep inside. And rocks began to be moved. In fact, a number of tombs were cracked open, and the rocks that sealed the front were moved. And in the course of this earthquake that shook Jerusalem like a rag doll, the temple, great massive building, was shaking and trembling. And in the inner part of the temple, which was a large rectangular room similar to the one we're in, about 2/3 of the way back, there was a great stone beam, a stone lintel, that went across the width of the room. And from that, it weighed several tons, and from that, this huge curtain hung that separated the holy place from the back 1/3 of the room, which was the Holy of Holies. And as this earthquake shook and trembled the whole city and the temple itself, this great stone lintel began to crack. And it collapsed, fell right down. When it did, it ripped the curtain, this massive curtain, ripped it from top to bottom. And all of a sudden, the whole inside of the temple was open, and the Holy of Holies was no longer separate and shut off. All of this occurred just in a matter of minutes. When you're in the middle of an earthquake, it seems like it's going on forever. In reality, maybe it only lasts 30 seconds or a minute and a half. minute and a half is a long earthquake. But, 10 seconds is a long earthquake when you're in it. It's amazing how long it seems to be. As you see everything around you, the very walls that look solid and permanent begin to shake like a mold of jello. And this darkness was over everything, the shaking, and then it stopped. And the quake stopped, and the clouds began to separate. And it was light. And Jesus Christ was hanging there dead. Now we're told that Joseph of Arimathea left word whether he was, the indication that he was not right there at the crucifixion, but became aware within a short time, perhaps someone had gone in and told him that Jesus was dead. He then went to the Pilate's palace. He was, of course, a notable man. He was a member of the Sanhedrin. He and Nicodemus were the two members of the Sanhedrin that refused to concur in sentence of death for Jesus. He went to Pilate and requested that the body be released to him. Pilate was taken aback and decided, this account is told here in Luke 23, that he went to Pilate and asked for the body. And again, you get the whole story at all the gospel accounts. Pilate was amazed that Jesus had died so quickly because he was unaware that he had been stabbed and bled to death. Pilate sent a centurion. He sent one of his soldiers there, one of his top men, aides, there to go out to Golgotha and to make sure that Jesus was dead. He went out there and checked, and yes, he was dead, came back, brought Pilate word, said, yes, he's dead. At that point, Pilate gave a signed order to Joseph authorizing him to take possession of the body. So Joseph left. So time has passed. Joseph goes out and the body is taken down. And we're told in verse 53 of Luke 23, he took it down, wrapped it in linen, laid it in a sepulchre that was hewn in stone, wherein never a man was laid. And that day was the preparation, and the Sabbath drew on. By the time he got there to the tomb, they got the body down, quickly wrapped it. The garden where Christ was buried was near the location of the crucifixion, but it was already getting very close to sunset. The Sabbath was drawing on. And so the burial was hasty. Now, the women that had followed him from Galilee came there with Joseph and the others. They beheld the sepulchre and how the body was laid. They saw what was done. But we're told the Sabbath drew on. It was very close here. Now, this, of course, is what has confused a lot of people. The common idea is that Jesus was crucified on a Friday and raised on a Sunday morning. And the idea that he was crucified on a Friday comes right here. Well, he was crucified on the preparation day. He was buried right before the Sabbath. And Saturday's the Sabbath, and so Friday was the day of the crucifixion. That's the way the thinking goes. But you see, you have to put the whole account together. John brings out very clearly in John chapter 19, verse 31. The Jews, therefore, because it was the preparation, that the body should not remain on the cross on the Sabbath day. For that Sabbath day was an high day. They besought Pilate that the legs might be broken. See, normally people who were crucified died of asphyxiation. They simply got to the point you couldn't lift yourself back up and get another breath. That's why breaking the legs speeded the crucifixion, because it made for such excruciating pain that you couldn't push yourself up to get a breath. And so within a short period of time, you simply expire, not able to get your breath. But Jesus' legs weren't broken because he was already dead. He had shed his blood. But John tells us that the Sabbath before which Jesus was crucified was a high day Sabbath. That's what most of the commentators and those who look at this don't understand. You see, you go back to Leviticus 23 and we find that not only is there a weekly Sabbath, but there's 7 annual Sabbaths. Holy days, high days. Holy convocations. And the Sabbath before which Jesus was crucified was a high day Sabbath. Now, if you come back and let's just look at a couple of accounts. Let's notice first in Luke 16. Luke 15:47 tells us that Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, beheld where he was laid. We read that earlier in one of the other gospel accounts. Chapter 16, verse 1. When the Sabbath was past, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, Salome, had bought sweet spices that they might come and anoint him. And very early in the morning, the first day of the week, they came to the sepulchre at the rising of the sun. They were coming there not to celebrate the resurrection. They were coming there to embalm a dead body. Now, Matthew tells us when the Sabbath, or Mark tells us, Mark 16:1, when the Sabbath was past, they bought sweet spices. But notice what Luke tells us in Luke 23. We read in verse 55 that the women that came with him from Galilee followed after, beheld the sepulchre and how the body was laid. They returned. We're told in verse 56 they prepared spices and ointments and rested the Sabbath day according to the commandment. Now, wait a minute. Mark said they didn't buy it until the Sabbath was past. Luke says they prepared it, and then they rested the Sabbath according to the commandment. How do you fit all this together? Well, very simply. The Passover, the year Jesus was crucified, and by the way, both in 30 and 31 AD, the Passover fell the same way. It came on a Wednesday with the celebration on Tuesday night, just as it is this year. Jesus, you see, celebrated the Passover with his disciples on Tuesday night, just as you and I celebrated the Passover on Tuesday night this year. He was then arrested in what we would term the wee hours of Wednesday morning, was crucified during the daylight portion of Wednesday, was buried just before sunset at the end of Wednesday. What happened at sunset Wednesday? The Sabbath began. Sunset Wednesday, we gathered together here in this room, most of you did, for a night to be much observed. The beginning of the festival of unleavened bread, the beginning of the first holy day of the days of unleavened bread, a high Sabbath began. Thursday was a Sabbath this week. Jesus was buried just before sunset on Wednesday. He was in the grave Wednesday night and Thursday, one night and one day. He was in the grave Thursday night and Friday, 2 nights and 2 days. He was in the grave Friday night in the daylight portion of Saturday and was resurrected at the end of the weekly Sabbath. 3 days and 3 nights, just as he said. Now, when you put the account together, we're told that Joseph of Arimathea took the body and buried it right before sundown. The women beheld where it was laid. Everything in Jerusalem was closed at that time. In fact, the shops all closed at noon there prior to the high day Sabbaths. So there was no buying any spices then. We're told that after the Sabbath was passed, Mark says, the women bought the spices. That's right. The Sabbath, John tells us, was a high day. Not the weekly Sabbath, the high day Sabbath, Thursday. Once the holy day was passed, all the shops were open bright and early Friday morning. They went and bought the spices and spent the day grinding them up and boiling them up and preparing and getting everything ready. And then, as Luke says, they rested the Sabbath according to the commandment. The weekly Sabbath, distinct from the high day Sabbath. And therefore, Sunday morning, bright and early as soon as the light began to dawn, was the first moment they had the opportunity of going out to do what? To embalm the body. But you know the story, when they got to the tomb, he wasn't there. He was gone. The tomb was empty. John tells us in John chapter 20, John chapter 20 verse 1, the first day of the week came Mary Magdalene early when it was yet dark. It wasn't even sunrise, just beginning to be light on the eastern horizon. She got there to the sepulchre and she saw the stone taken away. And so she ran back to get Peter. Ran there to the house where he was, banged on the door and said, "Come quick. Somebody's robbed the grave." John, interestingly, records, he's the only one that records the fact that he outran Peter. Interesting how we remember things, 60 years later, John still remembered. I ran faster than he did. We both took off running, but I beat him there. But when John got there, he just sort of stopped. Peter came puffing and huffing up behind, and he just ran right on in. And then John stepped in. And we're told, when they got in, verse 5, John got there, he stooped down and he looked in. He saw the linen clothes lying, yet he didn't go in. Then came Simon Peter following him, and went into the sepulchre, and he saw the linen clothes lying there, and the napkin that was about his head, not lying with the linen clothes, but wrapped together in a place by itself. By the way, this is one simple verse that proves that, among other things, but this is one simple place to go to prove that the Shroud of Turin is a fraud. Because if you've ever seen, the Shroud of Turin is one cloth and claims to have the imprint of the head to the feet. Well, according to the account, his head was wrapped with a totally separate cloth than the rest of the body. The napkin was not lying with the linen clothes that had been wrapped around his body. The napkin that was about his head was elsewhere. They were two totally separate cloths. It's the people who do these things sometimes don't even bother to read the account. Verse 8, then went in also the other disciple, which came first to the sepulchre, John. And he saw and believed. He was evidently the first one with whom it really registered what had happened. Well, they went away and they went to their home. Mary stood outside the sepulchre weeping. She had come back there with them, and he was gone. The place was empty, and she stood there and she wept and kept, looking in. Every so often she'd look in. Then she looked in, she saw two angels sitting there where the body had been. And they said, why are you crying? And she said, they've taken away my Lord, and I don't know where they put him. And then she came back out of the tomb, just perplexed, overwhelmed emotionally, and Jesus was standing there, but she didn't recognize him. And he said, who are you looking for? Why are you crying? She, supposing him to be the gardener, never really registering with her who it was, said, if you've taken him hence, if you've taken him somewhere, please let me know, and I will take the body. And Jesus said unto her, Mary. And she turned and said unto him, Rabboni, Master. And Jesus said, no, wait, don't touch me. I'm not yet ascended to my Father. But go to my brethren and say unto them, I ascend to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God. Now let's notice back in Luke 23. Luke 23, verse 56. Back to Matthew 28. Each account adds in a detail that the others don't. Matthew 28 tells the story and of how the women were told, verse 7, go tell the disciples that he's risen from the dead. Verse 8, they departed, ran to bring the disciples word. Verse 9, as they went to tell his disciples, Jesus met them, saying, all hail, and they came and held him by the feet and worshipped him. Now here, just a short time earlier, Jesus told Mary, don't touch me, I'm not yet ascended to my Father. Later on, he appeared and allowed them to embrace him. Clearly, he had ascended to the Father in that interim. You see, early on the morning of the first day of the week, during the days of unleavened bread, the wave sheaf, which had been cut at sunset on the Sabbath, when the Sabbath closed a few hours earlier, just at that time, the first sheaf of grain was cut. It was ceremonially presented to God that morning. And then the harvest was able to begin. Jesus Christ was the first fruits of those who slept. Jesus Christ ascended, the same one that descended, ascended. And he took captivity captive when he did. Jesus Christ triumphed over death. The account is given back in Daniel chapter 7. Daniel chapter 7. Daniel writes in verse 13, I saw in the night visions, and behold, one like the Son of Man came with the clouds of heaven, and came to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him near before him. Can you imagine the scene in heaven? The great majestic throne room of the great God of the universe. God sitting here on the throne that is described in Revelation and Ezekiel and other places. The great, bright, brilliant light emanating out, the rainbow-like colors. The 24 elders and the creatures before His throne, and angels 10,000 times 10,000. The Ancient of Days. And the Son of Man came in the clouds of heaven, and came to the Ancient of Days, and they brought Him near before Him. And there was given Him dominion and glory and a kingdom that all people, nations, and languages should serve Him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, in His kingdom that which shall not be destroyed. Jesus Christ had triumphed. He had conquered sin in the flesh. He had triumphed over sin. The one who was been in the beginning with God, who was God Himself, the Word. The one who was in the beginning with the Father, the one who was the instrument of creation, the one without whom nothing was made that was made, emptied Himself of that power and glory that He had shared with the Father from eternity, emptied Himself, became flesh, took upon Himself the nature of the seed of Abraham, and lived as a human being, and triumphed over sin in the flesh. Was taken and executed, His blood poured out for you and for me to pay the penalty. Was taken, and His cold dead body was laid in a grave. And 3 days and 3 nights later, He came out of that grave, breaking forth in power and radiance, ascended to the Father, came before the Ancient of Days, was brought before Him for what must have been a time of exaltation and celebration such as you and I cannot even fully grasp. As He came there before the throne and was received by God the Father, and was given dominion and glory and a kingdom. Jesus Christ came and instructed His disciples for 40 days after the resurrection, and finally ascended back up to heaven. He that descended now ascended. And when He did, He took captivity captive. And He gave gifts unto men. 10 days later, on the day of Pentecost, the Holy Spirit was poured out to empower those who responded to God. Our deliverance from captivity is not the result of our power and our effort. It is the result of the miraculous divine hand of God. The same one who descended has now ascended and is pouring out those gifts. And the time is going to come, in a few years ahead of us, when that one is going to return to this earth, but this time in power and glory. And He is going to take power over the kingdoms of this world, and the kingdoms of this world shall be the kingdoms of our Lord and of His Christ. We're here during this week, brethren, celebrating a festival of freedom, a festival of deliverance. Deliverance made possible by the power of God. As we celebrate this festival week, let's be deeply conscious of our deliverance and our deliverer. Let's be deeply conscious of the reality of what took place, that we may never be enticed and allured to go back into what God has called us out of, that we might forsake Egypt in our hearts and with urgency go forward to the mountain. Not the physical mountain that shook with fire and quaked that the children of Israel came to. But the heavenly Mount Zion that Paul describes in the book of Hebrews, that we might ultimately come to inherit a kingdom that shall never be moved. The starting point of inheriting that kingdom that shall never be moved is that first and foremost we were delivered by the power of God, that we might respond to our God and our Savior with our whole heart.